Thanks everybody for their statements this morning. I just want to start off the first question in relation to Dr. Casey. There was terminology in your first statement that I would find deeply distasteful. Deeply distasteful. You used the word killing 8 times. It's wholly inappropriate to use that terminology in relation to this issue. And I think you should refrain from using them kind of terminology. Just part of your statement, you say, if the Oireachtas is incompetent to legislate for assisted dying, my question to you is, then who is? We are the legislators. You know, there's a court, there's a Supreme Court and so forth, but we are the legislators. So if the Oireachtas is incompetent, then who is?
Thank you, Senator. And once again, I was trying to use the most anodyne language possible. Intentional taking of life, intentional killing, rather than, I could have used the language used by the Supreme Court itself, but I thought that
well, I think you should have.
I personally would have found that a little more life terminated. I thought that might be, if people didn't know that came directly from the judgment. But again, with the greatest respect, there was no intent to inflame whatsoever. On your question about the competence, if the Oireachtas is not entitled or constitutionally able to legislate or make policy within the parameters of the Constitution as it currently exists, then it would be ultimately, if you wanted to make it possible, it would require a referendum. But in the first instance, there's no definitive judgment on this question. My colleague, Dr. Mulligan, said Fleming is a definitive judgment. I absolutely agree on the questions that were pleaded and argued, which concerned the scope of Article 40.3 and the legality of the Oireachtas' statutory ban. Definitive in that respect, but not definitive in this respect. And so the Oireachtas is always entitled to sort of probe the boundaries of its own authority. Legal advice is always just advice, even from the Attorney General. The Oireachtas is always entitled to legislate if it thinks it has a fighting chance, and the Article 26 mechanism is there for a reference to the Supreme Court if the President wants to test the constitutionality. So those routes are there in the first instance. But if those result in a strike down of the legislation, then the ultimate recourse, if you can't do it under the current Constitution, would be to amend the Constitution.
Okay. My substantial question is obviously to get to the heart of this issue, and it's a complex issue, don't get me wrong. And we talk about the kind of the constitutional nature of the Fleming versus Ireland judgment, and it was unequivocal to say, look, as legislators, we have, I suppose, the remit to legislate for assisted dying, if we so will. Okay, that's unequivocal. And hopefully someday assisted dying will be legislated in Ireland. But I pose this question, and this was raised last week in relation to end-of-life care, that those in this situation in relation to the double effect. So I pose this question, and I know at the heart of the Constitution is a right to life, but there's also a right to one's life, and how they choose how to, bring that life to an end when they're coming to the end of their life through an illness, very kind of complex illness and so forth. So I pose, is it the basic human right that somebody has a say in how they end their life? That has to be, through a kind of legal mechanism and a medical mechanism. And that's how I think what's assisted dying would be posed. Because what's the difference between somebody that's months or weeks away from their life, that coming to the end of life through a terminal illness, and somebody that, a doctor that will administrate morphine that hastens their life? So that's the fundamental question I will pose in relation to your submission today.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Deputy Kenny. Look, it's really, you're getting really to the heart of like the difficulties here. Okay, the first thing I would say is that, you know, you're talking about there being a right to decide to end your life, and I think, look, we are only lawyers. Okay, so we're here to tell you like what the courts have said the Constitution means, and they're the rights that are protected by the Constitution. They're not necessarily all the rights that exist in the world. Like ultimately rights, you may rightly believe there is a right to die, and that's a conversation about a moral, pre-existing moral right that you believe in. So I think it's just important to distinguish those things, right? You may well be right in a moral sense that there is a right to die. All we can tell you is the Constitution says there is no right about that. So that's the first thing I would say. But you're absolutely entitled to characterise your judgments about this and your views about this in the language of rights, you know, if you so wish. The second thing I would say in terms of the distinction between, you know, the palliative care, I suppose people who would strongly believe in that distinction would say it is all around this idea of, well, double effect, you're just trying to relieve pain, you're not taking an active step to end life. And essentially, that is just a big philosophical debate. Like, do you believe those things are different or not? And I'm sure there have been many thousands of PhDs written about this. And that, as legislators, like for you, that's why I wanted to talk about those issues, because you do have to make a judgment to say, well, the law says X. Do I fundamentally believe there is no moral distinction between actively ending life and passively ending life? And that is ultimately a decision for you, I think. And then the final thing I would say is that what is very important about drawing the analogy with the kind of palliative care, morphine administration situation is that is only really relevant in terms of terminal illness. Okay, so a huge decision to be made if you do decide to legislate for assisted dying is whether the criterion is insufferable pain or something like that, or terminal illness. And to my mind, there are very, very big differences in that. So, you know, are you saying you can only access assisted dying if you are very, very near the end of life? You know, we know what the end of the road is. That's not the judgment some jurisdictions have made, where they will permit assisted dying, where you may have a very, very long life, either with pain or without pain. So the situation of someone who is, for example, quadriplegic might be able to access assisted dying in some jurisdictions. In others, they would not. They're not terminally ill. Situation of somebody who is experiencing extreme pain, but not terminally ill, you know? So I think that's what's really important for you to think about. You know, if you do believe in legalising assisted dying, and you do believe it's a good idea for the rights kind of based analysis that you've presented, who should access that? Because I think there's a huge difference between saying it is accessible to people who are terminally ill, and you might say 6 months to live, a year to live. They're all difficult things to define, and doctors won't be happy with being asked to give you dates like that. It's an important thing to bear in mind. So I'm sure you'll be talking to doctors over the course of this committee. But that's a really, really important distinction, because I think if you get into the territory of allowing assisted suicide for other reasons that are not about terminal illness, then really the kind of palliative care morphine analogy isn't really helpful. You know, it is a totally different world.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Okay.